Um, Welcome everybody to the 2020 Victoria Tea Festival Revival. We are in our 21st hour straight where we have been talking tea with some amazing folks. We just had a great session with Kimmy over at Whisk Premium Matcha in Vancouver. We've had Takaki-san on from Japan. In Fukuoka, we had the Wazuka Tea Festival folks. We've had musicians performing alongside the Chinese tea ceremony in Yunnan province in China. We've had O5T join us, Camellia sinensis from Montreal, Postcard Teas in England. It's been an amazing festival, and it's just gonna. We're definitely in the home stretch here. We're at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and we're joined today by, of course, my co-host, who's been with me the whole time, Ryan Moen. But we're also joined by Scott, Scott of Scott Tea Blogs. Welcome to the show. Scott.
Welcome, Scott.
Okay.
Hey,
Well,
welcome all.
I just there's an error that just occurred while I tried to get you on the screen there, Scott. So we can hear you, but we can't see you yet.
What?
The computer decided that it wanted to be difficult, but we'll figure this out. We can hear you, so maybe you want to give us an idea of what you are. What is Scott T Blog all about? What is your? Maybe you could introduce yourself to the people watching right now from around the world.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you, Jared. My name is Scott Norton, and as was mentioned, I have a tea blog, but I've been working in the tea industry now for close to 20 years. Originally as basically like the tea tasting kid, someone who would go into a tea house and, either a tea house owner would, throw something in front of me and do a quality sort of QC. Eventually that turned into working with tea houses and doing that as a job, whether it be for tea houses in San Francisco's Chinatown, where I kind of grew up and lived for a while in the early 2000s. But eventually it turned into basically folks bringing me to places like Korea, China, Japan, and having me do some of the sourcing with them. So I've helped start some tea businesses within the United States. I've also helped in terms of, again, quality control. And that morphed into tea education, whether it was lecturing, kind of like what I've been doing in New York and New York City, working with museums. I've done programs with the Guggenheim, with the Pacific Heritage Museum, where tea was the focal point and kind of looking at it from different historical inroads, whether it be like what we'll talk about today, the Song period, but also looking at things like the tradition of Gongfu Cha, the sort of global history of tea, and how we kind of find the sort of threads of these historical trends that still continue to this day. Scott Tea, this blog that I've had for, 7+ years now, is kind of just my musings on tea and time. I think there's a really interesting link between those two forces. We sit and we enjoy tea and kind of appreciate time passing. But then as we do that, we contribute to this quality, this sort of history of tea, as we kind of formulate it as we make tea right now. So even right now is a little stitch in time that we're going to be adding to this, broader tapestry of this tea culture that continues to evolve.
Yeah, awesome. And you're joining us from New York. It's some New York State, I should say. Is that correct?
Yes, I made the move from New York City to New York State during this mad time we're in. So.
Wow, yeah, and it's been hit pretty hard where you are in your neck of the woods in the world. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Hope you're staying safe out there and wishing you safety and good health, good sir. But let's. I'm gonna be enjoying I'll make some tea while you're talking here.
Yeah.
What are you wanted to talk about song period powdered teas, and that's an interesting topic. I kind of got introduced to it with the art of not the art of the book of tea talks about like these three kind of periods.
Hmm.
And it mentions this period of time, and when you were saying you wanted to do a talk on powdered tea, like historically and in Song period
Yeah.
China, not a lot of people know about this period. So I'm really interested in what you have to say. Um, yeah, let's see.
Um, I'll share what I know, and I have a little presentation. We can kind of use it as a guidepost for conversation if you want. I can
Sure,
jump
sure,
right
sure.
into that.
Yeah. Let's
And
hear a little
why
bit.
not do that as we're kind of doing this? So I'll click the present mode, and let's see if we can jump into this.
Sure.
I one of the junctures, or one of the segues um, into the history of Song period tea and why I'm so interested in it is partially because when I got into making tea kind of more seriously, whether that was gongfu cha or um, especially as I started delving into Chanoyu, where now I've studied that for close to 15 years, maybe a little bit longer, since 2002. So um, and very seriously since 2005. This whole idea of using powdered tea is a thing.
Yeah.
It's not really a thing in Gongfu Cha, but it's definitely a thing in Chanoyu. And there's always this talk, and you mention it in the book of tea. There's this talk of the sort of historical origin of it, and it being kind of sandwiched between certain periods in tea's history.
Right.
And it's always been fascinating to me to kind of work our way back and maybe find approximations as to how that was made, how people made it. And something very interesting about food and tea and beverage culture as a whole is that when we're trying to turn back the clock and try to figure out something from a historical period, it's kind of like chasing a ghost. It doesn't exist really. It doesn't exist anymore, at least. And so this process that I've been going through for the past maybe 5 to 10 years of really seriously trying to figure out what's in a bowl of Song period tea has been a process of kind of reading the texts as well as trying to understand, through the sort of historical and poetic allusions from these texts and from these art history, what are they actually drinking? What might it taste like? Is it anything like a bowl of matcha? Kind of historically, where Song fits is in this sort of later period, actually, of China's long, long history. As we may know, archaeologically speaking, tea has a 6,000-year-old history. And so when we talk about powdered tea from the Song period, we're talking about something that in sort of a historical context is actually pretty recent. Prior to then, tea was a medicine, tea was a sort of life elixir. But it wasn't until the Tang period, which is right before the Song period, that we have tea really as just an enjoyable beverage. And at that time, it was enjoyed with maybe flowers, roots, a bit of salt, as was described by Liu Yu.
Right.
But prior to that, tea, again, was still a medicine and still continues to be a medicine to this day.
Cool.
During the Song period, this is a big sort of global version of Song period, from 960 to 1279. We have in this sort of goldenrod here, Song state, at its height before it breaks in the late 1100s, or mid 1100s, I should say. And there you also have Japan, you have the Goryeo state, you have Xixia, which is Tangut, you have the Tibetan kingdom, you have the kingdom of Dali, which is kind of modern day Yunnan, various other countries, and the Liao or Kirtan. Tea during this time period, though, had been sort of expanding beyond its historical locus, and that historical locus was in the kingdom of Dali. Originally, even before Dali, you had this sort of borderline between modern day Laos, Burma, or Myanmar, Nepal, and modern day Yunnan, and Sichuan. And tea expanded into the east regions of China at this time and produced a very different tea at the time of the Song, moving away from a tea that would have been roasted, put into cakes and then ground into sort of this rough powder to be then boiled in water or simmered in water into something that became a refined process where the cake was then ground into a fine powder, pressed into another cake that was bound together, usually through like a waxy sort of camphorous substance originally, and then just bound together through, I believe, just the oils of the tea. And that's the sort of tea that made its way into the courts, made its way into the sort of populace of China at this time. And here you kind of see the spread of that originally from this sort of southwestern region out to the east, eventually to Japan and Korea, and making its way up the sort of interior of China, and then also going through the sort of ancient tea horse road further south. Very, very quickly, I'm just going to kind of run through this. These are the sort of images of cakes. These are images from the Qing period, but they are depicting Song period Longfan Tuancha, which is this dragon phoenix cake, sort of early branding of the Song period. And how they made those cakes, well, they steam the tea after picking it, and then they grind the tea and then compress that into a cake. But then to make the actual bowl of tea, you'd have to break down that cake once again, sift that powder, and then usually, put it in some sort of conveyance mechanism, like a tea caddy. And then you go through the whisking process. And I'll kind of go through that today very briefly as we drink our bowl of tea. During the Song period, the sort of panoply of different tea wares expanded. And this is sort of the classic 12 that were depicted in the Chaju Zhuzan by Shenan Laoren in the late Song period. And then, kind of reflecting that and reflecting the spread of tea and tea culture, you also get this diversity of form and diversity of styles. And these are all sort of the famous kilns during the Song period. And if we had a whole year to go over this, I'd go over this in great detail. But just to kind of yeah. So, and please interrupt me. Ask any questions that you might have. This is a Song period dragon kiln.
Where you where's this information? Like this looks like a significant amount of research and compiled. Where is this information gathered from? Is this from museum study or from?
So a lot of these images are either coming from museum collections or actually through like Christie's auctions and bottom auctions. A lot of this stuff has become very popular, especially as the Chinese economy has been booming. And so a lot of folks are trying to buy this stuff back. What we see here is a jianyao bowl that's stuck in its sagger, which is this device that's used in one of these running kilns or dragon kilns. And so that bowl cannot be liberated from that sagger, but even that is sort of a historical artifact and also just shows the quality of bowl. But yeah, exactly. A lot of this is coming from, either the British Museum, the Met, a lot of these non-Chinese, conspicuously non-Chinese collections, where these were picked off during times when, maybe the Chinese economy or Chinese sort of hegemon of that area was not as powerful, couldn't keep this stuff. And a lot of this originally would have been from scholarly collections or from imperial collections.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool.
This is a hump mold that you're seeing here. This is an incised bowl with boys and prunus. These are some Jizhou Yao with various different, this has an applique. I have a reproduction of that, which we'll make some tea in later. Jun Yao, Longchuan, and Qingbai. These are also very famous kilns, and these are all tea wares. So there's a famous cup stand, which we'll go over. And then also during the Song, one of the things that you begin to see the more prevalent use of are ewers. And the ewer itself was either a way of conveying water or wine. And during this time, it became specialized, at least within the equipage of tea and teaware. And it's one of the reasons why you can produce the sort of beautiful foam for tea is not just the whisking, but also the use of a very precise pouring device, such as one of these yours. Kind of akin to like why we like to use gooseneck kettles today.
Right.
Because it actually does a great job of in this case, pointing into the bowl of tea, what we later call dian cha,
Right.
pointing the tea. And here you see a number of probably courtly servants making the tea.
Okay.
When we think of the act of making tea and the art of making tea during this time period, it was often not done by the person who was actually consuming the tea, unless you were a farmer or a tea connoisseur who is, part of the actual production of the tea. You yourself, if you're a courtier, probably wouldn't be making that tea. So,
Oh, interesting.
yeah. And this is a great case in point. You see this sort of very big class divide in this image. You have the sort of cha tong making the tea and grinding the tea. In the corner, you see the gentleman grinding the tea with that sort of drum grinder of the late Song period. And then you see somebody who's pouring water into a large bowl to make tea. And then you see what looks to be two scholars and a priest who are kind of sitting around enjoying a scroll, eventually to enjoy some tea. Another case in point, here we have some arhats enjoying some tea made by this very typical cha tong character here in the center. And here we have a grave painting. This is a mural that was found in a tomb. This is from the Liao kingdom or Liao dynasty. They're contemporary to the Song, and they too have tea culture that is highly influenced by the Song. And here you have a tea stove or a little brazier.
Nice.
And here we have a painting actually from Emperor Huizong, who himself was a tea person. He was very proud of the tea that he appreciated, and he was kind of an aesthete during the Song period, setting the sort of taste, or he was kind of like a tastemaker in the imperial court of that time period. And he wrote what was called the Daguan Cha Lun, which is the great treatise on tea during the Song period, where he describes, what you want to look for in a bowl of tea. And he's one of many during this time period who began to sort of build off of Liu Yu and sort of take it into a different direction, but also where they're getting a lot of this information, where they're getting a lot of this know-how are from tea producers and tea connoisseurs who are much further down that sort of social ladder. Mm-hmm. And here we have some individuals. These are probably tea sellers, most likely from Fujian. And here they're being depicted conducting what's called a doucha, or a tea battle or tea fight. They're basically competing, trying to say like, oh, this bowl of tea that I've produced here, I'll hold one up. The bowl of tea that they've produced is going to hold the foam the longest, and therefore it's going to show, not only how fresh the tea is, but also my prowess in whisking the tea. So
we got to start doing that at Jaga Silk. Awesome.
We've done a few in New York City. It's very silly, but at the same time, it's like, this was a way for people to show their mastery over something, in the same way that kind of now when we think of, really these like barista competitions, or even like gongfu cha, it's this mastery of this craft or of this art. This art, one of the reasons why I love the Song period too is because you really do begin to see tea expand outside of China. During the Tang period, the 600s to 800s, it did make its way into Korea and into Japan and into sort of Southeast Asia and sort of Central Asia by way of trade and tribute states. But during the Song, you begin to see a lot of these areas really begin to take on their own style. Here we have some Goryeo period celadon, absolutely beautiful pieces. These are from the National Museum in Korea. If you're ever in Seoul, you have to go here. And then here we have Saicho and Mio and Eisai, both of whom brought tea to Japan, and oftentimes are credited for bringing in the sort of homunculus version of tea of like, oh yes, it was ready, and from here tea ceremony or Chanoyu, Japanese tea ceremony, kind of comes forth. But really, that didn't happen until the contemporary period of the Chinese Ming court, and really there was a lot more development even after the Song period, during the Ming period, of powdered tea. That continued from the Song to the Yuan to the Ming period, but we don't oftentimes think of the Ming period as a period for powdered tea. Mostly because you have this imperial edict that says that at this point we're not going to powder our tea, we're not going to put it into cakes to become powdered tea, and instead we'll move towards using loose leaf tea. So in many ways, the historical trend of this powdered tea, this sort of mocha or ground powdered tea, ends in the Song period, at least in the way that we've seen it just now, and it becomes somewhat more diffuse as well as more diverse as it makes its way beyond the borders of imperial China and its period states. So it itself is a little bit of an anomaly when you think of it. This is how I kind of go about making the tea. I grind it and sift it. I've refined the process since these images, so it's even more fine. I run it through a sieve that's about, I think, 20 microns thin, maybe 80.
Okay.
And so it's akin to a very low grade matcha at that point.
Right.
So, and then you go through the process of making it. So, which we'll show you right now. So that's all I want to go over for the moment.
Okay.
Because I also want to just share you a little bit more.
We had a question. There's a small village called Dali in Yunnan with some famous tea masters and teas. Maybe the village name comes from this background. Is a question we have from Finland.
From this background?
Yeah.
From.
Maybe this came up when you were showing the map. I think that's when this question came up.
Oh yes. The kingdom of That's exactly where it's coming from. That would have been one of the capitals if I think it was the center of that kingdom at that time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. That's so interesting.
Bill, I want to know, or am I still in weird presentation mode?
You are, yeah. If you wanna, there you go. Okay, you're back. You're back.
Logan.
That was just beautiful selections of the pottery, and I think we all enjoyed the tea battle.
Yeah, I was so into that. Was the moment. That was awesome. It's like
there are some texts from this period that if you dig into, I think Sai Chang, who's a calligrapher as well as a poet from this period. Sai Chang talks about the tea battle. He talks about also like what type of specific wares they use and like what the foam looks like. Try digging into his chalu, and you might find a little bit more. There are also some scant records around this as well, most of which have not been translated. So, yeah,
that's awesome. It was really interesting. Even like the grave or the tomb sort of like imagery, and I love that bowl. It's like trapped forever in its birthing space, and just really fascinating. And this you do think that like when I talk about powdered teas historically, I always my understanding, and it's obviously wrong, is that it kind of ended with the Mongolian invasion. But I guess that's not the case. Obviously, there wouldn't be this sudden death. It would just be less prominent. Like it would go from a foreground role to more of a background role, but not a total disappearance, I guess is what you're talking about, hey?
Yeah, the cutoff is in the early Ming period. So I think it was in 1391. Don't quote me on that, but you had the first emperor, the first Ming emperor, who decrees that tea is no longer going to be pressed into cakes and then ground. And part of that is because it's a bit of an extravagance to do that, quite a bit. You use about 5 to 10 times the amount of leaf tea to produce just one bowl of tea,
right,
which is crazy. It's also kind of pointing towards the fact that even while you had powdered tea, you always had steeped tea.
Right.
You know, that's when you think of tea as a medicine, it was always this leaf and like, you know, this here's a caddy from the Northern Song period. So up until the 1120s, they would have been making tea caddies like this. I like to keep the tea that I use for grinding, and this is a raw kind of wild white tea from Fuding, so like a Fuding Baita. What is interesting is that a lot of what we see kind of turning into Song period refinery kind of comes from a lot of these either non-tea objects becoming tea objects, or they're coming from traditions that would have originally had tea as kind of a medicine. And so it kind of links it back to before it was powdered. Here we have something that's being co-opted into this other culture, this medicinal culture, or this cosmetic sort of finery culture. And so, yeah, the Song period is kind of this flashpoint in Chinese history, at least. But to your point exactly, it kind of fades off. And before it fades off, it cross-pollinates to other cultures. So the Japanese tea ceremony carries on a lot of what we see in the Song and sort of early Ming period. Partially because during that time period, you had a lot of Buddhists, predominantly Buddhist monks, coming over to the Song court and to later the Ming court, and picking up these things and bringing it back as new technology, you know. And Buddhism and Buddhist temples were always a center for medicine. So he played part of that.
Makes sense. You know, and that is actually for me a huge drawing piece to what got me into tea in the first place is this idea of it being a profound medicine for the system, and it just an overall interest in health. And then honestly, from there, it's kind of gone into this more like an exploration from some of these flavor elements and this history and culture. For me, the inn was definitely this healthful component, and it's so interesting, you know, like when you really think about how that is the root, that is how it all, you know, even before these, you were talking about it in this talk just now, like before the milled teas, we had this boiled tea. I often like to tell people that's kind of like the ancestor of the masala chais that we know today, right? It's this decoction. It's this, you know, there's a perspective in Chinese medicine that if you really want to get the essence out of your botanical, you got to do that intense decoction, right? So it's an interesting perspective, but it's also an interesting point. Like for me, it had always been like, I guess I was almost too linear in the way that I was thinking, that it was just this end, begin. But obviously it's not like that. That's not how human culture, society, anything works. When something diminishes, it doesn't necessarily mean it diminishes everywhere. So there is like this cross-pollination process like you're talking about, but I'm also just this communication to different areas, like the history of tea in Russia, for example. That whole area of study is quite fascinating. And then, you know, going into, you know, making your way east, making your way west, making your way north, making your way south, like there's just such an interesting opportunity to follow that lineage. Super fascinating stuff. Love that old map too. Wow, that was really cool. Just to see these old names. I love it. You wanted to make some tea. Was that like an unusual chasen that you had there, or like what is that?
Let me walk you through at least the versions of teaware from this period, and we'll make tea as we go through it. So,
sure.
In the early Song period, in the Song period, we think of whisk tea as, you know, taking a whisk. You know, this is a modern tea whisk from Japan.
Sure.
Made in Nara, which is a historical place where tea whisks are made. And you don't see this form emerge until the really late part of the Song period. You actually see their pictures or paintings, one of which I found of a sort of street peddler, a toy vendor actually, who has within his huge collection of stuff a Song period tea set, and tucked in the corner is a whisk that looks more or less just like this.
That's fascinating.
But when you look at something like the Chaju Chuzan, the sort of illustrated book of tea from the late Song period. You also have a whisk that looks very similar to this, which does not have a splayed out tines. They're very well kept together. And they're
quite interesting.
Slightly longer and more flexible. This is a sort of crappy version of it, but they still actually make whisks like this in Japan. They usually use it for buku buku cha or arai cha, I think is another one that they use, where you whisk the tea.
Quick interruption, sorry. Is it possible to tilt your camera down a little bit? We can't quite see the space in front of you. That would be really interesting to see.
No. Yeah. Let's do it. Oh yeah, look at that. So you tell me, I could be the headless tea man. I don't mind.
No.
So
we can see you pretty good. Yeah, that's a great angle.
Great. So, and what I found is that this whisk actually makes a very thick foam. The sort of freed up tines kind of allow it to flex and bend as you're going through the different steps of making Song period tea, which classically you would have 7 draughts of hot water added to the tea as you're whisking.
Right.
So, and we'll go through that. Prior to the whisk, though, you would have actually something very similar to this, which we now use as a tea scoop. But back in the day, it would have made in either gold or silver. If you were, unable to afford that, maybe bamboo, and that would be used as a rudimentary whisk. I don't know how they did it. There's some writing about this of how they do it, but it doesn't sound like it would do the same as something like this.
No.
So,
just basically stirring it in, I guess. Hey,
you're stirring it in, and it links it back to the earlier forms of tea that you might see in, Lu Yu's Cha Jing, where you would have kind of a scraper device that you could pull some of the sticky foam off of the tea that you would be boiling. But yeah, I don't know. So,
awesome. I want to just. I guess as we go into whisking this, it's just, there's a little bit of time we spent making this call happen, and it's such an interesting conversation that we're having right now. But we are at the 40 after mark, so I just wanted you to know there's about 5 more minutes left in our talk that we have.
Let's do this as fast as lightning.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see this. Okay, cool. So let's.
So I'm going to put in about 3 to 6 scoops of this tea. This is the Fuding Bai Cha. And I use a lot, partially just because I think it produces a better result.
Right.
It's a lot of tea.
Okay.
It's also a lot of, leaf tea, as I mentioned. The steps that I'm doing right now are similar to those described in Wei Zhan's book. But it's also being adapted to forms that are still continued to this day in Chanoyu, where you would have a setup like this, where you have a Temoku bowl. This is a Jizhou Yao replica bowl sitting on a Tenmoku die, which is this sort of wooden dais. Originally would have been made in wood and lacquer, though they also make them in ceramic. What I'm doing now is I'm just making the tea into a thick paste, and for folks who have made koi cha, they'll know this process.
Right. Okay.
And this is going to be the first of 7 steps.
Oh, crazy.
So
Okay.
2 points, and I just kind of thin out the liquid at that point.
We're on step 2 right now.
Step 2,
Okay.
still very much about making the sort of paste water thin. By step 3, I'm going to start picking up the speed. And I might need to stand up. I hate doing this sitting down.
Yeah, totally. By all means. Yeah, I'm often the headless speaker for these sessions.
We'll do that. And if you look at all of those old paintings, and they're making tea, they're always standing up.
Yeah, of course, it makes sense. It's like I often explain to people these whisks are made for this. Or kneeling, right?
So China even back then, was more of a chair society.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So a lot of what you see is not on the ground,
Hmm.
but in a chair. So, so I think this is DN number 5. And by this point, I wish I had another camera so you could see.
Mm-hmm.
You're beginning to see the foam rise. It's still pretty thin, but as I speed up, it will begin to thicken. By 6, you can really speed up. And then by 7, you're just kind of softening it out.
SS BM Golf wants us to do a T fight. Yeah. Okay. Very cool. So it's just adding a little bit of extra water, whisking a little bit more generously with your vigorousness, and gradually starting to build up that froth.
Yep. And then by the last moment, you're just kind of doing the finishing touches. There are no big bubbles on the foam at this point. It just looks like meringue. If you've ever made one.
That would be fascinating to drink. Yeah.
It's yummy. It's, if you like white tea a lot, it's like you're drinking literally a lot of white tea. So
very cool.
It's actually pretty ridiculous how much tea you think you're going to drink when you do this. But these forms are preserved. I don't know if you can see any of in this bowl.
If you hold it up a little bit more. Not that, sorry, vertically up. And then tilt it toward up again, vertical, up. Perfect. Okay, we can see that a little bit. If you tilt it towards the camera just a bit, obviously we don't want you to spill, but that looks great. Okay, we got a good sense of that. It's kind of like got some frothiness in the center.
Lovely.
Okay.
You have to see the keyboard.
Ah, there you go. Okay, awesome. Okay, very cool.
So the foam is white. It's a sort of cream white.
Okay.
And the flavor is incredibly floral, like a fresh white tea. So
awesome. You're kind of half headless, but when you crouch like that, we're good. Yeah.
So
awesome.
Anyway, it's still a process that I'm refining, and for this reason, the form that I'm doing, which involves just using this sort of suribachi, Japanese suribachi. This is a style that they would have used during the early song. It's not until the mid and late song that they start using that stone mill that you see in like making matcha today. It's called a ishi usu or a cha usu, the stone tea mill.
Yeah.
So that's my next step, hopefully, and that will turn this into a much more refined process, and it will also improve flavor. And it will move it much closer towards getting what is described in these texts, this very bright light, but also beautiful and kind of, well, certainly aromatic flavor, but they also describe the flavor being that of some of these, I don't know, like some of these very lightly fragrant flowers. There's one text that describes it as like the flavor of fresh snow, if you can imagine. So yeah, and mind you, this is trying to reproduce something that existed in a late song rather than early song, because in the early song they would have impregnated this with the flavor of different flowers or incense, which in itself would be crazy.
Amazing.
Like just to make that. Yeah.
You know, the living history, bringing it to life. A huge thank you to you, Scott. I want to remind our viewers that they can find Scott at Scott T Blog. It's, I imagine, it's scottt.wordpress.com is what we have for the website. They can check you out at. People watching the archive version of the show, there's a lot of information that Scott's gone over. Been really amazing having you on the show. Really appreciate you making the time to join us here on the Victoria Tea Festival Revival, Scott. Ryan, did you have any words to say to Scott before we part here?
It was just so impressive. I love the fact that at the end you were able to display within it was a rushed presentation, but almost an iconic bowl that you started your presentation with as a photo. I was like, it was gorgeous. So I love the fact that you've honed in this whole ceremony and this whole practice to the point where you're enjoying it, and then you're actually still going to further it so that you get greater depth and actually do bring that history back to life. So thank you for taking that time.
No, thank you guys. Thank you for making this happen too. This is a joy.
Awesome.
So,
thank you, Scott, for being on. I hope you have a really good rest of your day. And there's been some lovely comments on the chat here. Lots of enjoyment from our viewers around the world. Thank you again, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you, guys. Stay caffeinated, please.
Yeah, definitely there. All right, take care. Bye, Scott.
Bye.
Okay, so that was Scott Norton with Scott Tea Blog talking to us about some the Song Dynasty powdered teas. Always a fascinating subject. When Scott wanted to come on to the Tea Festival Revival, we were excited for him to do that talk. So learned a lot, really fascinating stuff. That was our 21st session today. We're almost on to our 22nd. To you, Ryan.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thanks for that. It was such a concise presentation that fits in at the end of our 24-hour period. Obviously not the end, because right up next is coming Jen. We just call it formally Jen. Can I just say Jen, the tea mistress? Because I think we're all friends here, because Jen is one of the reasons that this festival ever happens. So we're looking forward to seeing her in about 12 minutes, which is quicker than usual. But you know us, we'll find some sort of technical difficulty. It'll be a great 15-minute break. So stay tuned and just hold on. And thank you for tuning in. Bye.